Russia's invasion of Ukraine has transformed the world. Millions of people have fled the conflict, while civilian casualties are rising. Associate Professor of International Relations at Wits University, Professor Vishwas Satgar, says that even if there is a ceasefire based on between Russia and Ukraine, based on commitments for Ukraine not to join NATO, there won't be a lasting peace. He joins us now to talk more about this. Professor Satgar, good afternoon to you. As I understand what you've written about this, you suggest that this conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the contest that's really between NATO and Russia, is a result of how the Americans tried to remake the world, I suppose, in their image after the Cold War. It's quite a big claim to make. What do you mean by it?
Well, Stephen, it's very real. I mean, the United States has been what you would call the hegemon, the dominant power shaping our world, our cultures, our ecologies. They've been doing this since after World War II. You had what was called the Pax Americana. And it's a very, if you like, a common language that we use in international relations and characterization, where they built various institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, at that time the GATT. And then, of course, after that, in the 70s, there was a bit of a crisis, but in the 80s, there was a remaking, if you like, of U.S. leadership of the world. And this was largely centered around, if you like, the ideology of neoliberalism, free markets, placing the dollar Wall Street at the center of the global political economy and prompting the global south to adjust to this. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the backdrop to it. Now, with the end of the Cold War, the United States basically claimed victory, and it presented itself to the world in a very triumphalist way. And it also, in some senses, with conceit, suggested that its way of life, its standard of civilization, is the terminus of history. Now, this is very, very problematic. But nonetheless, it faced certain choices at the end of the Cold War. One of those choices was to take on board the opening of peace that Gorbachev, the former leader of the USSR and probably the last leader of the USSR, which was towards a nuclear-free world. The Soviet leadership understood that amassing nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons, was leading to a dead end for humanity. And that in the end, mutual annihilation meant nobody would win. So this was a moment for the U.S. leadership to really internalize this basic fact and truth. And they did not, actually. Instead, they turned their back on denuclearization. They turned their back on a nuclear test ban treaty and others. And they continued bringing nuclear warfare as part of their national security thinking into the post-Cold War world. Now, this in turn shifted other countries that have nuclear weapons. It shifted the British, it shifted France, it shifted China. And everybody, all these powers, began to think about a post-Cold War world in which nuclear fighting was appropriate, and that you need to kind of build your nuclear capabilities alongside your conventional military capabilities and so on, as the U.S. has been doing. So this is a very, very important backdrop to what's happening in the context of Ukraine and the Russian invasion.
So, Professor, I mean, in a way it is my job to argue with you, so let me make an argument against you. You say that it was the Pax Americana. You present it like it was a bad thing. But where countries adopted the American way of life, if I can call it that, people became freer, there was more democracy, and there was certainly a lot more wealth. Let's look at Japan. Even China, you could argue, started to follow aspects of the American way of life. What's wrong with that?
So the fact of the matter is, over 50 years of having sort of U.S. dominance, we still have very sharp fault lines between, if you like, the global north and the global south. And if you look at the period after World War II, the United States inaugurated the Cold War and the rivalry with the USSR, and that was used as a pretext and an excuse, actually, to destabilize numerous democracies and countries in the world. In its own backyard in Latin America, it trained militaries, and it supported various military dictatorships from 1964 in Brazil, and in Argentina, in Chile in 1973, and so on. And so basically it didn't really bring progress, and it didn't really bring development to most countries. It actually brought violence. It brought authoritarian politics to many, many of these societies. In the context of Africa, Africa had its own kind of perspectives, whether it was the self-reliance paradigm of the African, at that time the OAU, whether it was delinking, whether it was African socialism. Well, the US ensured that Africa was a battleground during the Cold War. I mean, in literal physical terms. And Pretoria was enlisted in that conflict. So, and a lot of people lost their lives. At least 10 million people lost their lives in the context of US imperium and it attempting to shape the destiny of countries in the global south.
Okay.
I mean, today we are sitting with the legacy of that, and particularly with structural adjustment programs and so on. And our countries are very weak. There's poverty, there's inequality, and we now have worsening climate crisis.
Okay. So I mean, if I accept all of that, and as I say, it is my job to argue with you, that may be true, so let me accept that for the moment. But if no one stands up to Vladimir Putin, let me put it quite plainly, if no one stands up to Russia and the leadership which it has now, which I think you would agree with me, Russia's not a free country. I can't go and stand on my soapbox and say that the president must be voted out tomorrow. Something very definitely will happen to me. If I were to say it on TV, I'd be very lucky just to escape with a fine, although that has happened. But if no one stops the Russian military, if no one sort of applies force in return, what happens? Wouldn't Putin say, well, okay, I'm going to keep Ukraine, now I'm going to move into Poland? Where would you draw the line?
So Russia under Putin is an autocratic regime. I accept that. And I accept that the democratic space is very thin in Russia. I accept that there's tight control on various liberties and freedoms. I accept all of that. But in the context of what we are dealing with a nuclear-armed power. This was very different from, say, Hitler or Mussolini. This is a very new historical development, if you like, in the European context that is now engaging in expansionism. My own view and my argument is that to deal with this is not to remilitarize and to militarize and escalate Ukraine. Actually, Zelensky, for instance, if he was committed to a peaceful outcome, he would have maintained a principled approach throughout this entire situation, saying that he and his people are not willing to confront the Soviet Union or confront Russia with military might, and they are a peaceful people and they want a peaceful resolution. I think this was an upended Putin in a very major way. It's sad, though, that Zelensky has actually chosen to take on arms, and in a sense positioning Ukraine as a proxy of the US, the EU, and NATO. And I think that is...
Prof, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. I don't like to interrupt you, but I mean, you're saying to a democratically elected leader that he must ignore what his people would have wanted to do, and I guarantee you his people would have had memories of living under the Soviet Union. They would see that as living under Russia. I realize there are distinctions and non-distinctions here. I don't think he would have been able to control the situation, frankly.
Well, maybe. I mean, I think this is all speculation, but I think the bottom line is that an anti-war politics is a morally righteous politics. If you look at Nelson Mandela and our transition, Mandela embraced the paradigm of peace. We would have ended up in a bloodbath in our transition period. I mean, there were all kinds of signs of civil war and so on. And he took the bull by the horns. He challenged his own movement. He challenged the National Party. And he challenged all of us in society. And he took us over that so-called Rubicon. If you look at Mahatma Gandhi in India, in the context of the battle with the British, he also, if you like, challenged the militarists in his own ranks, and he stood the course, and he pursued, if you like, a non-violent path through democratic breakthrough in India. There are numerous examples. I mean, I can give you the example of Martin Luther King Jr. in the 50s and 60s in the United States. I mean, there were big debates with him and others amongst the if you like, the African left in the U.S. He stood the course, and they won after a century the right to vote and so on. So there are moments, and I mentioned Gorbachev, of course. I mean, there are moments in history where, and it's in this case, where, if a consistent, principled, non-violent anti-war politics prevailed, I would argue it could have steered history in a different direction with different possibilities. Let me also say this, that I do think that the Western European leadership also has to take responsibility for the situation. Like the USA, the Western European leadership did not internalize that momentous shift in history when Gorbachev actually surrendered the Soviet Union and called for a nuclear-free world. If they did, they would have then embraced and incorporated both Ukraine and Russia into a pan-European project. And that would have ensured, in my view, that we wouldn't be where we are as well. It's not too late. It's not too late for them to also consider this.
I expect a vigorous response to what you've said today. Professor Vishwas Satgar, always good to talk in the international